So the topic I'll talk about is how bodies and external things help us think. And more specifically, I'll start with the thinking with things, then thinking with our body, talk about interactivity and interfaces in buildings, and then social affordances, all topics you asked me. So in thinking with things, it's clear that we often interact with models and that these facilitate creativity. I chose an image of crumpling paper for obvious reasons, because you're architects. Hold on, I'm going to hide the floating meetings. The claims that I have with respect to creativity, and using that as an example of thinking with things, is that it often emerges through interactive cognition. The standard view of creativity, as explained by psychologists, is essentially an internalist one, where the creative process is happening inside the mind through some kind of imagination or some kind of generative process. That's distinct from using the artifacts themselves as a component of creativity. No one ever denies that the creative person might sketch or use sculpt with materials, but the creativity is not supposed to partly reside in the distributed process between human and thing. It's supposed to be this, I do something out there, that's an action, but it's not a thinking, it's an action. I look at it, I see the result, then I internalize how I represent the outside thing. I think about that, then I make another decision, then I act again. And the looping process is just perception and action. It's not seen as a distributed process or an extended mind process, where that itself is that the outside is actually a presupposed component of my thinking process, such as turning an object. It could be something I do outside rather than try to mentally rotate it. And if I'm working like that and I'm tightly coupled temporally, that process is a thinking process in my and many other people's view right now. So I'll talk more about artifact-mediated cognition. I won't talk about notation-mediated cognition. And then body-mediated cognition, how the body itself is a constituent in the creative process or a thinking process. I'll then later go on to these social affordances and interactivity with buildings. So our artifact-mediated cognition. Here is an example. Can we think with cards? Well, for an artificial intelligence system, clearly not. All the decisions about what card to put out next, or what card to accept and then throw out is made internally, and it's just an action that's performed. But that has a curious property, that if you were to reorder the cards, there would be no reason, no artificial intelligence system would ever reorder the cards. There's no point to that, because you're not making a move in the outside world. You haven't changed the state, the competitive state of the game by reordering the cards. That's just some kind of odd thing that humans do. But if you see rather that ordering cards is part of a way in which we change things outside to facilitate cognition inside, then instead of seeing these making the decisions inside and then making a move outside, what we have is we have internal operators, but then we can perform an external operator to reshuffle the cards or reorder the cards and reorder them again and then come back. And we could find our way to this position by going through external operators rather than internal operators, which might be harder or slower or faster or not lead us to see certain things. So in this view, we have in the head and in the world cognition. That's when the agent is appropriately coupled temporally, tightly coupled. All right, well, so what's happening here? Does the master actually know in advance what he's going to do? In this case, it's a he, I believe. The calligraphy is essentially an emergent process that comes through the interaction. And some of it most decidedly has to do with the pressure on the brush, because that's one of the things he's controlling. But exactly how it emerges, it's such a tightly coupled process temporally that the creativity, what's interesting about it is emerging jointly through the in and the out. When people are playing with models, doesn't that what role does the model play? So they can't fully predict what they will see or think before doing it. And moreover, the notion of compliance, which is here I have a cup. When I bring my hand and I squeeze around the cup, the final position of my hand, odd as it is the result of just pulling tendons tightly around something. That process of how exactly it's going to end up is very computationally intensive. And people don't compute it. They just use their body for that. The tendons make this elastic force around it, pulling it tightly. Now, they don't know what's going to happen until they twist it. And where it twists depends on the shapes that they're working with and how they're joined. So they can't predict what it is. And yet, that's partly how they're exploring the problem, is through this physical interaction with the outside. In this famous picture of Crick and Watson, the physical setup of the double helix as the model of DNA was very central to their understanding of how the crystallography solutions, and deciding what were the right crystallographic solutions and so on. But what I like about this is that when you have something outside and you're talking about it, there's multimodal timing. You're speaking and gesturing, and there's this interaction and there's joint activity. The one is looking at what the other is doing. They're thinking collectively, and particularly the pace of thinking is partly determined by the thing you're pointing to and its shape and size. People don't study pace very much or at all, in fact. In cognition, and I think it's a very central question, how pace is involved in many of our processes, including, of course, in how buildings determine pace. So the bottom line of this part is that we often think by coordinating internal and our external activity with artifacts. So it's a coordination between what goes on in our head and what we are doing with the artifacts. Now let's just look example at how this further stimulates creativity through the case of ambiguity. So who among you, how many of you, if you just speak out, who sees a face here? Who sees a woman? Well, apparently none of you see either, but.
I see both, but I was waiting for, okay, Rafael also sees. Rafael, you can speak up, woman or face?
Well, I see a woman.
Okay.
So.
Did you see a man?
Each in turn.
Okay, there you go. So once you see it, of course, you toggle back and forth. It's just initially, but this is an example, as we've seen in so many cases, of a duck rabbit or the famous Necker cube and so on, where you see one thing and you conceptualize it in one way, because not only do you see not only do you see it as a pattern of a certain sort, so you conceptualize it like that, you have a name for it, then you get this new perception. Now, how can working with the outside lead us to these new discoveries that might be useful? So the idea would be that this shape is ambiguous. It's multiply interpretable. So here I take a shape, and what shapes can you see here? Well, you could see three X's. You could see 3 clipped hexagons. You could see a triangle with 3 small V's coming out of it. You can see in this almost what you want to see. You could even see the torso of an oversized male. So you're free to change what we see almost at will, but interaction helps enact the change, and that is where the extra comes from. So I say, what do you see here? And you're going to start your little organization process, making your gestalts here and there. But what if we were to rotate the object, or occlude it with part of your hand, or stretch it, or move your head in, or move your head to side, or zoom in and out? These are not uncommon interactions that architects do with various sorts of images, and they help you see it in different ways. Here's another example. Now, please, can you all simultaneously call out what you see?
Square.
There.
Okay, so I'm gonna go through it, call it out quickly, okay?
Square.
Square.
Square. Square.
Diamond.
Diamond.
Okay, so here we go through this process, and you see a square, you see a square, you see a square, and now everybody, some people were not sure here, but everybody's sure that's a diamond, right?
Yeah.
So just this act can bring about a changed perception. Now, if you were talking about an ontology of what's out there, in the one world, it's filled with squares, but suddenly just by rotating it, it can be filled with other things. Here's another case. Now, in this case, it's a chance encounter. All right. Yes, I'm sure it's safe. But anyway, the thing is, without the physical action, there would be no chance encounters, because you wouldn't be encountering things like that. I mean, you could see things you never saw, but physical interaction allows us to have degrees of freedom over things that we otherwise wouldn't have. The outcome was not predictable in the sense that it's hard to do the transformation in the head. And so you really don't get the impact of the result. It's possible, but in this case, it's not too hard. But in other cases, you can readily guess it's too hard. And the interaction wasn't really a standard move in the sense of, had they been building this thing, they're manipulating parts. They're not used to manipulating the whole object when it's a physical object. You could say they are, because that's the space of possibility in a physical model of this size. Larger one, not. But it's not the ordinary move, which is why they didn't see it before. And what the result is that we can do things outside that we can't reliably do inside our heads. Okay, so the bottom line is that we can stimulate creativity by interacting with things, partly because we suddenly see things that are hard to imagine. And this is a different, it's not a shocking view, but it is not the view, surprisingly, that is a prevalent or dominant view inside the science of creativity, the study of creativity. I want to segue now into thinking with our body and how we use our body itself as something to think with, to facilitate thought. So the question is, do dancers or choreographers ever use their body as a model to think with? So now look at this dancer. He's practicing, or he's practicing. And what is he doing? He is not dancing in the way that he would dance the real performance. So why would he do this if he can't be practicing any bit of it that he would display? He might get the rhythm right, so he might be practicing the rhythm, but it's a real abstraction in the sense that his body isn't doing the things he will do in performance. They're doing it in a tiny version and quite different with. So that way of dancing is called marking. And in this case, the dancers are marking in order to think of new movements. So some of them they already have, and then they're seeing if they can change them or advance them in some way. And the way I understand this is they're using their body as a scaffold to dynamically visualize possibilities. So they're doing this little thing, but they're visualizing doing the bigger thing. And they'll do this for hours in a way in which you would never dance full out for hours. So when I was studying dance creation with Wayne McGregor, the choreographer of the Royal Ballet, this is his contemporary company, Random Dance, and they came to UCSD. Wayne and I met up, and we liked each other, and so we decided to collaborate on some things, which lasted eventually 7 years. And I would always go to London if he would make a new dance with his company, and I would capture it with 6 cameras, and I would sit there the whole time and watch. And I would interview him morning and night, or regularly. In the first year, morning and night, an hour each time, and try to begin to understand what exactly was going on. And then later did some interviews with the dancers on a number of topics, one of which was marking. Now you look at this, and on the one hand, your eyes just say, well, I know what they're doing, kinda. But on the other, if you look at it the way a cognitive scientist might, you say, what on earth are they doing really? And that's what I asked. What on earth are they doing really? So the idea is somehow that what they're doing, they're not doing it just because they get tired. If they did it full out all the time, it serves a cognitive purpose beyond the purpose of allowing them to practice longer. And the idea that I was exploring was that it lets them scaffold their imagination. A scaffold is something that gives you support, which otherwise it takes away some of your degrees of freedom. So it gives you support as long as the degrees of freedom it takes away are ones you're happy having taken away. Like on the side of a building, something that keeps you supported up high, so the degree of freedom of falling down the z-axis is not there. So the idea that if it's scaffolded, you can think faster or think harder or more precisely and with less effort, and you might also be able to learn faster or better, which was something I tested. Now, this is marking. Okay, this is the full out dance. And marking is doing it in a less energetic manner. And in this case, on fingers instead of legs. And when she's doing it on fingers, she's imagining the leg motion. I met this woman coincidentally at the American Airlines Club while we were both waiting for planes to go to different places. I don't know how we struck up a conversation, and it turns out that she was one of these Irish dancers. And I said, do you know how to finger mark? And she looked at me and she said, well, of course I know how to finger mark. And I had been waiting to get a good video of someone finger marking, and I took out my camera and took her right there. So that's a lovely case of finger marking, and you can find interesting whole productions of broader finger marking broader than just finger marking on on YouTube. But so what is marking? Well, it's skeletal in the sense that it's some of the raw underpinnings without the extras that is an understructure that can be projected onto. Projection is, if I were to ask you to fill in X's and O's, play a game of X's and O's or tic-tac-toe in your mind, you would you would visualize a tic-tac-toe board with the two lines, two parallel lines, one set here and one set here. And then you put an X and you'd put an O and you'd put an O there, and you play the game out. Now, when you do that in your mind, that's called imagination. When you do what I just did and you imagine it, I call that projection. So here's the board. You all see that board, right? And now I put the X in that corner, and I didn't put it in any old place. You knew I put it in the right place. So what is that process that is like imagination but projected onto the world? That that projection is a kind of imagery onto the world, onto space. So whereas the size of the X in a board in your mind, when you're imagining it with your eyes closed, you can't tell me how big it is, or you can't tell me exactly where it is in space. I mean, you could imagine it in a place with a size, but when you just do the X's and O's, it's almost disembodied free-floating X and O of any arbitrary size, because that is not what is important to the mental image. But when you do it outside, you have to tie it to a specific, you have to anchor it to a specific location and so on. So now you can look for properties here. And similarly, if I show you a geometric problem and I ask you to try to solve it, you start to do, here I give you a right angle triangle, and I say, oh, you know, you start putting in projections as you see whether this or that might work and help you solve the problem. All of that is projection. So my belief is that what they do when they do marking is that they physically provide this understructure, this scaffold, they project onto it, and because they have the scaffold, they're able to get more veridicality, more precision in their mental image of it, and that, well, it's in the projection. So, of course, the outside is an imperfect physical model of the real phrase. It's a 3D moving sketch, if you like, and it's an abstraction. But when they do this, the dancers attend to very specific parts of the movement, and they conceptualize that aspect more completely than they are doing it. So if they're interested in a particular arm motion, they might do that arm motion and fixate on their fingers, and their fingers are approximately the position they want, but what they're actually fixating on might be more precise, and certainly it would be tied into a more integrated movement. So a marked movement is a sort of abstraction, but it's represented internally in a more detailed manner. And now here I got a few of them to come out and show me. Here Antoine is doing a full out phrase. So the dancers don't need music to dance. They love music. They like to dance with music. They enjoy music, but they don't need it. They have the clock inside. So his timing will be perfect. And this is his full out phrase that he did, not in the actual dance that they were just making at the time. All right, I'm showing you the whole thing. I know it's quite long. All right, and now I said, Antoine, just mark that. Now look at how much smaller it all is and how much less effort there is. It's still quite complete. He could, in principle, leave some things out. He certainly could leave some body movements out.
Great. How come you made the sounds now when you marked it? You didn't make sounds before when you did it for real. Were you thinking it through?
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing it as I go.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's also maybe, it's not a rhythm. It's not to get a rhythm, it's like a help.
All right, so there's something going on between what he's thinking in his head and, oh, in this case, he's also making sounds that are facilitating his performance. Now we're going to look at one more, and this is small marking. Look at this. And before he had actually raised a leg, now there's nothing like raising a leg. There's just this tiny little thing. Dancers will even mark on the metro, the subway, the tube on their way home. So they can practice in all sorts of places if they're just marking. And that is the difference between full, large marking and small marking.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, she's marking full.
That was full.
Yeah, but it wasn't really
And the
because she didn't.
marking it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not using energy, but I'm thinking, what's my pathway? Or
All right. So her real full wasn't quite as full as it would have been. She was speaking. She didn't have quite as much emotion in her movement as she would on stage. But the key thing she's emphasizing is the energy, and she's thinking the pathway is the movement along the, more or less along the floor that Laban used to characterize one of the ways that dancers, what you need to mark down in order to know what the dancer is going to do. So here's a case where
this is the smallest one.
this is the smallest one. So she's here distinguishing between an actual tombé pas de bourrée and just a conventional gesture with the hands that indicate it. So that kind of marking is more symbolic than the other one, but it's used all the time. That the ballet instructor will put her finger around like this to indicate time now for a pirouette. And all right, so marking provides some kind of dynamic support for projection. Dancers project aspects of the full out phrase, so they're thinking with the movement that they would perform, and they project that onto the moving form that is not so full out. So this helps, the movement helps the dancers visualize, project, the aspects that they might want to explore specifically. They're not concentrating on every aspect of the full out movement. They're concentrating, or on the marked movement, they're concentrating on a specific aspect typically. And movement does some of the work of visualization by scaffolding or supporting the projection. And it also provides an integration. So if they want to look at a particular part, they still has to be in situ. It still has to be part of the integrated thing. And this motor focus helps them to direct attention on key elements. Now, this idea of marking is all over the place. People just haven't studied it or noticed it before. These are synchronized flyers, the French Acrobatic Patrol. I'm sorry, I've forgotten their name. They're the, I don't know, the Armée de l'Air. So I didn't give you the full thing, but you can even see this guy who was the captain, when they bank steeply and they're turning it, you can even see him enduring the G stress. So they're really thinking this is what it's going to be like in flight, and they have to get the synchronized movement, so they practice it on land. And they do it by marking. Here, there's a whole body language for marking synchronized swimming. So here's hands for legs, and you saw that we did fingers for legs in Irish river dancing.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
All right, so you can see how they practice, and it's through marking. It's not the same as when they're in the water. All right, so my bottom line here is that in these, at least these physical creative activities, or in synchronized activities, people are going to use their bodies quasi-symbolically. So if it's among others, they could look at each other and see what they're doing. But in the case of, individuals, they're using their body as like the brush. It's scaffolding their thinking, their practicing, their cognizing, their creativity, their exploration, and the body is essential to it. So the body is an instrument of cognition there, the same way that somebody using notations or somebody using external models would be. So these are now two examples, one where we've used external physical artifacts, and one where you're using the body itself as a thing to think with. Now, moving to interactivity in buildings, I wrote a very long paper on interactivity in buildings, and it really was a contrast between interactivity as is conceptualized in HCI. In fact, it's not well conceptualized. So the inquiry itself was a study on how to think about interactivity. It's a new theory of interactivity, but not new in the sense that it introduces something completely novel, except in one way. It characterizes causal interactivity, and then it shows the difference between that and network interactivity. So there's a clear account of what it is to have network interactivity. Perhaps that's a contribution, but the third area is sort of social interactivity or building interactivity, and that's quite different than the other two. But I don't have time to give that talk. I do have a paper, maybe you want to share it with people. So when you talk about interactivity in human-computer interaction, the interaction takes place at an interface where the one, A, is interacting with B, and B acts back on A. So it's bidirectional. A interacts with B and causes a state change in B. B causes a state change in A. But the way they do it is always mediated. There's a point at which there is the interface between A and B. They're not allowed to be the same thing in order to define, for us to define it, because it is a relationship between two things, A and B. So there must be some gap between A and B. That is like separation in some sense, a physical distinction between A and B. That physical distinction is the interface, and it's conceptualized as a surface. It could be n-dimensional surface, but it's a surface. For instance, the analog digital, where we have our hands moving over something, we have our mouse input, that is, we're doing these physical actions, and then so we have physical digital, and then it's going into the digital world and changing things in the digital world. And we talk about the interface as that's one interface, the physical digital interface. Another interface is what we see and how we manipulate it on the screen, but the screen is not real in a certain sense of seeing things. When you come to buildings, everything is three-dimensional, and you say, well, what's the interface? We know people are interacting with the buildings, but what's the interface? And it was absolutely paradoxical to me. I must have spent over a month trying to figure out what on earth is the interface. I had a lovely conversation with Alan Penn, and where I was talking to him about interface in buildings, and I asked him, what did he think? And he said, well, when we're having this conversation in the room, we're in one interface. If I open the door, it's a completely different interface. And he was meaning that the social context has been changed because of the lack of privacy. So for him, the interface was different in the sense of the context of activity. It's a three-dimensional thing. It's not easy to understand. So I started thinking about this, and that is what that paper is about. It tries to define what architectural interfaces are, and of course, architectural interactivity. So we know that, I mean, this is clearly an interface of sort. Just by putting that thing there, not only does it prevent water from getting on the people, but it's got a lot of social consequences. Here's a space design for all different sorts of, it's Microsoft possibly, I think it's in London, one of the early Microsoft campuses in London, and it's designed for, well, not early, designed for different forms of social interactions. And you can see that they have created, through the use of carpet and furniture, one kind of region. These are all different activity spaces. Normally you don't expect people to do concentrated work here, but in fact, some people like to do concentrated work. And all of these constitute different little social interfaces. Here's a very clear case of it, the hatch of the 1950s and 60s. So a serving hatch has a real social interface. It really defines what you can and can't, not what you can and can't do. Somebody could stand here and have a philosophical talk with somebody in the kitchen. If one person were sitting here and the other person were sitting here, fine. But typically, one person is working in here and the other people are socializing in here. And there's a social distinction between the kinds of activities that go on, who's in here, who's out here. This is laden with social implications. Here's another one, a more recent one, and it really constrains the nature of social interaction in terms of how frequent and how easy the conversations are going to be and what the topics will be. If you want to have a more social cooking activity, you can open up the space. And here we have the equivalent of a sushi bar, a style thing. And the cook is over here, and this is more of a show with a free interaction between the people. So these are defining different kinds of social interfaces. We have more social interfaces. every building provides us with countless social interfaces. Circumscribing the interface is not so easy, and that makes it hard to specify what exactly the social affordances are, because the social interface is determining a lot of the affordances, and those are also social affordances. We haven't defined what a social affordance is, but the intuitive notion of a social affordance is that it is a structure which facilitates or makes possible, gives the opportunity for certain sorts of social interactions, and it doesn't facilitate all social interactions. So it's a subset, and we'd like to understand how they work. Now, the concept of intelligibility in architecture, or readability, or the semiotics of the space, that is something that's closely related to this, because people see what the space can be used for, or how you could read it as being something that is appropriate for this or that. So when somebody is scanning the room, the two people come in and they say, come on, let's have a conversation. They scan around, they choose something, and both know which what regions would work and what wouldn't work. So there's a kind of intelligibility to the space. If you come into a restaurant, you want to know the properties of the space and the social, the interface of it. Then different areas provide different kinds of interfaces, if owing to privacy and what's in gaze, what can be seen. So the space of interaction and social possibility is always being physically constrained by the architecture. The interior design too, but the architecture is, of course, massively important. And it's hard to analyze building interfaces. It's hard to know exactly what adding a wall will do to change the socio-spatial interface, or removing a table or chair, or opening a door, but they do alter social affordances. And so would introducing a mobile phone or a group printer. So it's very hard to know what is the social affordance, what is the social interface, the socio-spatial interface. But I think it's a topic worth understanding. If you look in an ordinary room, here would be like a college dorm or something, or somebody's room, it contains many potential interfaces for either social interaction or for physical task activity. Those are interfaces more broadly, but we could confine ourselves to social interaction. And you know perfectly well, I mean, cleaning, if it's done with another person, is a social act. It's a joint activity. So of course is playing, but sharing a closet could also be a joint activity, a social act, of course. So there's many kinds of social activities, and each one of them might take place in a different area. And they come into being when the people bring themselves into certain relations, so that space now is being used in that way, because the people are part of the affordance now, and you couldn't have a social affordance. The social, it affords the possibility for social interaction, but when a person is there, it affords it in a different way. If the person sits in a particular part, they're occupying a particular place. So you can't really fully understand it without understanding the dynamics that go on. They're part of that niche. And in the end, I came to view architectural interfaces as like a niche, a sort of social bubble. And when you do that, you can avail yourself of certain kinds of formal techniques for analyzing things. It's very many dimensional and it's very complicated, but it seems to me that is essentially, we wouldn't think that interaction in architecture is not as complicated as animal interaction with their environment. So no surprise. When you want to understand the nature of social affordances or these niches, you have to look at what social interaction really is. So here is a case, my favorite case of joint activity. The mother knows what to expect from him. He knows what to expect from her. He knows that if he doesn't do that, she's going to pull his hands up or do something. So they both are predicting how the other will behave. They both have a whole range of expectations. They're not supposed to have to talk, but if she does talk, then it's explicit regulation. So they're kind of making sure that the communication via an explicit method is saying what to do next. So they're coordinating their activities, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes the activity is coordinated implicitly because he knows what to do. She knows the order in which to do it, as does he. So when she starts tugging at his shirt down below and brings it up like this, is it coming down or coming up? I think she's just taking it off myself, but maybe she's putting it on. He knows that. So that was implicit coordination, if it's a he. I don't know that either. And
I think it's a she.
and you know, it just doesn't matter any longer.
It doesn't.
Well, compare the dressing in here with dressing in here. These are different sort of architectural interfaces. There's the lighting is different. The space, of course, is the big paramount difference. If they were to be working in here, we know the position that they would have to take in some way. There'd be a lot of different actions going on. So the interfaces are so different that although the general structure of behavior would be similar, we could expect significant differences. And this is part of what makes the concept hard to apply, but part of what makes it rich to apply, because of course, if we thought we were designing the closet to enable dressing in the closet, we might have designed it in a slightly different way. So we have different interfaces, and these constitute different socio-ecological bubbles that people operate in. So if you want to understand what's so special about social niches, I think a good way to understand it, that is human social niches, you ask yourself, well, what would it take to get a robot to participate appropriately? And when people are talking with each other, they're obviously people and not just, not digital things. So there's this back and forth that is cognitively demanding, even if he's doing all the speaking and he's doing all the gesturing. Well, of course, he's gesturing too, but there is a back and forth, even if the words are coming out of his mouth, because of his responsiveness to his gestures and facial expression, which is a response to what he's saying and his facial and physical gestures. So we know that social interaction is cognitively more demanding than very many physical interactions. And the interpersonal part of it recruits extra neural regions or systems not required during ordinary physical action. So it's not just the I know that you know that I know, although that's an important part. It's all the social relations that go, all the social neuroscience that has to do with emotional regulation and more that I wish I could just enumerate for you. So we have to identify social intent and identify the social act, and that's not so simple as just seeing what is being done. Social interaction also recruits more neural regions than simple observation of someone else acting. So observation of someone else acting could be there's a social element to it. That is, we're seeing something social, but if we're not ourselves participating, that's different. What do you think this woman is responding to? I'd be curious to know. I have two primary conjectures.
Maybe someone bumped into her.
That is definitely my primary conjecture. Another conjecture? All right. So his level of concern, and she's not saying, whoa, he's hot, although initially, if you saw it in a different context without him and stuff, but the degree of frowning and so on, I think he just bumped into her without paying any attention. So we can draw some pretty powerful social inferences and tell a story just on the basis of a snapshot. So that's going to take a lot of cognition. But when they're actually involved, it goes beyond that. And you could consider the arousal that would be happened in here. That becomes she's just been hit, so she's actually pretty pissed off, probably. Might have hurt, we don't know. And so the ability to adapt to the other person goes beyond just the understanding of the social intent. So I think one of the big things is this being involved, being a participant, having what they call skin in the game, is what happens in true social interaction. And that makes it something more than just picking up your pen.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we need to pay a
Oh.
little bit attention to the time.
All right, I have probably 3 minutes left. Okay, would that be okay?
Yeah.
All right, sorry, it just got away from me. So when you look at the interface, there are these other things that are happening. There's shared delight, there's embodied interaction, there's joint activity. The consequence is that we have a lot of elements that are present through having social co-presence and interaction. Both people are sharing situational awareness. Both people have agency, so they can participate in joint activity. Both people have emotions, and they're aware of each other. Those are all elements that we don't typically find. I'm not going to go into them, Ben. But sharing a physical space, if you want to understand the nature of social interaction or social affordances, you have to begin to have a better grasp of what is involved in sharing an action space for joint activity, because a conversation or any of those things are joint activity. Sharing emotional awareness. If you now just look at these things, you say, well, what are the social affordances here? It's fairly constrained what you're looking at, but you wouldn't call this a good singles bar. I wouldn't. I don't know singles bar, but I'm guessing that's a bad one. It looks to me like it would be a bad one. Here we can see immediately that this is not a face-to-face venue. I mean, it's an audience-to-face venue. So it highly constrains the nature of social interaction. On the other hand, the reason this is better for singles is because they're not being clustered in some way that really allows you to talk in threes or fours. It's meant to be for more binary conversations. And then we have social legibility that tells us this has got a lot of power. So when we look at a structure like this, we too can imagine the social affordances that each of these things provides, including someone occupying the space. He occupies a space, there's a power relation now. You have to face him. You can't sit beside him, you have to face him. And similarly, these people now, they can sort of use this to mediate between them and then share things. All of these represent notions of social affordances, which I think is just completely understudied. In fact, we don't really talk much about social affordances. So the conclusions are just that humans can use both their bodies and external things to think with. Interaction is a source of creativity by revealing things we didn't imagine. Interaction in buildings is really complicated because the interface is 3D and it's hard for us to know what that means. And it typically includes other people. When you want to understand social interaction, where people are, of course, co-present, they are usually assumed to be co-present physically, and that has cognitive and emotional consequences, such as sharing emotions, sharing situation awareness, sharing common ground, and sharing many goals. Very hard to achieve that through digital presence. This is the canonical structure, and obviously, if we have avatars in spaces, we're going to try to create this sort of thing. But I think the physical co-presence is very special, and that's all I want to say.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.